Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us today on Research on the Road. On behalf of Exceed and Research on the Road and Earth and Biological Science Department, we thank you for joining us. Those of you who are hikers or will be hiking this summer, pay close attention to a lot of the tips here just for you. Emily, take it away.
All right. So we're starting today on a little bit of a different route than we have been in previous weeks. So where we've been mostly showing our personal pets, Michael and I are unfortunately not owners of rattlesnakes. So tonight we're focusing on rattlesnakes, and we wanted to talk to our illustrious expert, Dr. Bill Hayes. And Daniel, of course, has rattlesnakes because that's Daniel's thing. And so first, to start off with, we're going to have Michael show us not a rattlesnake, but he's gonna let us know about a different species.
All right. So yeah, these might not be as exciting as rattlesnakes, but it's a snake that I'm sure many of you are very familiar with. They are corn snakes, and I say they. I have this here is Isabel. She is albino, as you can see by her white skin and red eyes. But she also has a sister here with me when I turn the camera around. And this black one here is Marceline, and these are sisters from the same clutch of eggs. So it's very impressive, just the variety of colors and banding types that you can see. Now, something I want to show you from, oh, they're making a mess. Guys. Now, if you can look closely at Marceline's eyes, you can see that they're a bluish color. Maybe she won't sit still now. But when snakes are about to shed, their eyes turn that kind of hazy, milky blue color. And then they'll usually shed their entire skin a couple days later.
I'm going to try to come back on Tuesday.
These are probably the most common pet snake in the reptile industry right now. You can find them pretty cheap at any pet store. And like, if you want like a really fancy color, they're going to be a bit more expensive. But they eat smaller rodents, and in the wild, when they're found in the wild on the East Coast, like in Appalachia and the American Southeast, they're often found near grain stores and like where they store corn for the winter, and waiting for any rodents or lizards to come by, and they snatch them up. And that's where we think they get the name corn snake. But that's about it. There's a lot of information out there about these guys because they are very common pets. So now I think I'll just go ahead and turn it over to Bill and Dan for our feature presentation, which is the reason you guys came here today.
All right, so we're going to have a bit of a show and tell about rattlesnake biology and why rattlesnakes are important. So to start off with, let's talk to Dr. Hayes. And Dr. Hayes, you've pretty much been a naturalist your entire life. And so we're trying to promote kids to get out and to enjoy nature and to appreciate and observe animals respectfully. So what can you tell us about your route to becoming a professional biologist, having started as an amateur naturalist?
Right. Do I need to, how do we get the screen on me?
I'll see. So
I grew up in Maryland, and in my home, I had a twin brother, younger brother, older sister, and three of us boys, we were always into snakes. My dad had that big influence on us. He had a few pets, and every Sabbath afternoon, we were always out on a picnic somewhere, some kind of outing, and we were always looking for snakes if the weather was right. And then as we got older, strangest thing happened. We had a Christmas thing in 7th grade where we had to put our names in a little bucket, and everybody draws names as to who they're going to give a gift to. And my brother and I happened to draw our two closest friends at the time. We went to the mall and settled on a couple bird books, Roger Troy Peterson, Field Guide to the Birds, and we thought it was a joke. Turned out those same two friends drew our names in a class of 30-some students. I don't know how that happened. And so the four of us started looking at birds. We wanted to use our books. So we have, so I grew up loving all types of nature. I went to college at Walla Walla University. I went on to graduate school, doing a master's degree there and a PhD at University of Wyoming. I would strongly recommend graduate school for those who have a serious interest in biology and nature. You certainly don't need that. It's a terrific hobby. That rattle is nothing more than loose skin, loosely connected. And so that when they shake it, there's no dust or magic beads or anything inside that makes the noise. It's actually the loose scales rubbing against each other. Did I see a snake crawl under that table?
Yeah, I think we lost the snake.
Okay, and so the rattlesnakes are using the tail as a warning, basically saying, stay away from me, okay? And very interesting structure. You can't really age an animal by counting the number of tail segments of the rattle, because they may shed 2, 3, 4 times the first year, maybe a couple times the second year, and then it'll slow down to once a year. And by the time they have about 10 segments, you can see the rattle there. By the time they have about 10 segments on that tail, it starts to break off. In captivity, they don't abrade as rapidly on rocks and other items. You sometimes see 20 or 30 segments, but it's an amazing structure. The tail that Daniel has in his hand is highly adapted for rattling. It's very richly supplied with blood. The muscles are. They've been studied. They can shake that rattle for up to an hour without fatiguing. Now, I would ask if Daniel could wiggle his fingers rapidly for an hour and whether he would fatigue. You got to do a little faster than that, Daniel. And I don't think he could keep that up for more than minutes, okay? So it's a remarkable structure. And the head is very triangular, as you can see. And that's because the cheeks are especially broad. They have a venom gland on each side. They have a pair of eyes that give them very good vision. They have the tongue, which is bifurcated at the tip and used for smelling. They have an extraordinary sense of smell. I could comment on that. When they open the mouth, they have the fangs, of course, and those are hollow, syringe-like things, teeth that are injecting the venom when they bite. They have in front of the eye a large pit that is between the eye and a nostril. The nostrils are just for breathing. Those are in the very front, but they've got this large singular pit on each side we call a facial pit. Thank you, Daniel. And that serves as another form of vision. There's the pit just below the nostril, slightly in front of that, and between the nostril and the eye. Nice look. And that is for another form of vision to see objects based on their temperature. It's an extraordinary structure. And if one of these young men have pythons have boas, and some boas and many pythons, they have these labial pits, similar pits or holes all along the upper lip on each side. And those serve the same function. So they can see a warm object in complete darkness. So if they are in a burrow where a mouse is, they can see a three-dimensional shape, and that's all they need to aim their strike. If they are in total darkness on a moonlit night, they can use that information. I had a colleague who had a congenitally blind rattlesnake with no eyes, and that snake would have no problem accurately striking at a mouse. And it would even aim the strike at the head neck region of the mouse, which brings about the most rapid prey death and minimizes the risk of missing a snake or missing the mouse when striking that forward moving animal. So these animals are exquisitely adapted as predators. They have effective defense against other predators that want to eat them, and they really do know how to use that venom.
And so all rattlesnakes are venomous, but not all of them have the same venom composition, right? So what is the differences between species that makes their venom different?
Okay, so the different species are going to live in different environments. They have had different histories. We believe that God did not create a rattlesnake, that it evolved and then has branched off into multiple species living under different circumstances. So it's very true. They all have fairly different venom, and it's remarkably varied. And it can vary not just between species, but within or among locations within a single species. It even varies during the lifetime of the rattlesnake. So in some species, the young snakes, they have venom that's better adapted for killing lizards. And then as they grow, that venom becomes less effective at killing and more effective at digesting when they switch over to feed on big, bulky rodents that are more of a challenge to digest. Bear in mind that as the snake grows, the venom gland gets much, much larger. They have much more venom available to inject. They do inject much more venom as they get bigger. And so it's more helpful to have a digestive venom than a venom effective at killing. So what do we have there, Daniel? What are our two snakes?
Well, I'm actually sure you can tell us what two species I have here. I'll give you a good look at the back of the tail there.
That looks like a Mojave rattlesnake.
Well, one is definitely. Which one? Let me close this up real quick so I can get you guys a really nice good view. So we have two different rattlesnakes. One I caught in Arizona. This one here on the left after his I caught in Arizona not so long ago. And then this one I caught here in New Mexico.
Well, that tail looks more like a Mojave rattlesnake. Are you going to tell me that's a prairie rattlesnake?
I thought this was a Western Diamondback specifically, because I know that there's
a lot of white on the tail there.
I noticed that, but I couldn't tell which one because compared to this guy, they're both about yearlings. Okay. This guy's much bigger than this one, and I know this one for sure is a scoop.
It could be aberrant. I can't see the tail well on the other, but if you look between the eyes, you could count the number of scales. And Mojave rattlesnake should only have like 3 scales between the eyes. The Western Diamondback should have more than that. Well, there's subtle differences. That does look like a Mojave tail with more white than black. The Western Diamondback has more equal amounts of black and white in the tail.
Well, this one definitely has more scales in between the eyes, quite a few, as a matter of fact, while the one that you did call a Mojave green definitely has very few in number. I don't know if you can.
Okay, so maybe the bigger one is just an aberrant tail on that one. Okay.
But hey, Dr. Hayes, since we're doing research on the road and promoting kids traveling outside, why don't you tell us a little bit about how sometimes kids get a little mixed up in what is a venomous snake versus a non-venomous snake, like this little guy right here. Give me 1 second while I get him out. So I'll put him in the bin with us. Can you tell us how we could tell the difference between that guy and these guys here?
Okay, well, the tail is the first clue. So anybody who is seeing a snake out in the wild, first thing you do is look at the tail. And the one on the right there looks like a gopher snake with a long, thin tail that tapers to a fine point, okay? That is always the first thing to look at. Whereas the rattlesnake, as you can see on the upper left there, they have blunt tails, and when they're born, that's just a single button. And then they add a new segment every time they shed, as I have mentioned, okay? Now, I want to point out that a venomous snake has toxins. It secretes toxins in its venom glands. It's a fluid that it actually injects when it bites. And a venom is something that has to be injected through a wound. A poison, on the other hand, is something that is swallowed or absorbed passively across the skin or some other body surface, okay? So when it comes to snakes, we think of them as venomous animals, not poisonous, but venomous, all right? Now, there are some non-venomous snakes we think of as non-venomous that have the long pointed tails here in the US that actually have enlarged rear teeth in the back of their mouth. They do have a toxin they secrete. They're not going to kill a human, at least the ones in the US, but they could make your hand swell if they were to bite and hold on for long enough for some of that venom to flow in. Now, they may use that to immobilize or kill their prey like lizards, but for the most part, they're nothing for us to worry about. Daniel and I pick up these snakes without thinking about it. We're talking about hognose snakes, ringneck snakes, lyre snakes. The two most common throughout the US would be ringneck garter snakes, ringneck snakes, hognose snakes. Those three. Technically, they're venomous, but they are harmless enough that you don't need to worry about them.
Yeah, and I love finding those little guys. They're actually a lot of fun to catch, even though they may be venomous and have those rare fangs. They're still beautiful creatures, just like the rattlesnakes.
Oh, yes, and I pick them up without worry. I'm not. It's very rare. It would have to be a big individual that held on for a long time for the venom to flow in. And even then, it's not going to do serious damage. Now, there are some in this particular family of snakes that are closely related in Africa, in Asia, and South America. They will kill you. But in the US, only rattlesnakes, copperheads, and cottonmouths are what we need to worry about. Now, in the East, we have cottonmouths and copperheads, and they have long pointed tails. And so we need to be careful with that. There's other ways to tell them apart.
Definitely, which would be like the head as well that we could look at as well. But luckily, so like you said, what we're going to look for is that blunt, stubby tail, just like this guy right here, who's a Southern Pacific rattlesnake, right? So as long as I see that blunt, stubby tail, I know that I'm looking at something that's possibly venomous.
Correct. And leave it alone. Turns out 80% of the bites coming to Loma Linda University Medical Center are to males because we're stupid. 45% of the time, we're messing with the snake, which is stupid, and 20% of the time, we have alcohol that's clouding our judgment, which is stupid. So we need to be very careful with these snakes, and we make a mistake when we play with them too much and get bitten. We can have a $500,000 medical bill, and it's there's a possibility of having severe injury. A deformed finger, you could lose a finger, you could have your hand frozen so it doesn't bend anymore. You could have severe kidney damage. You could die. Bad things can happen.
Yeah, and I learned quite a bit of this at your studying under you, Dr. Hayes, and also with Dr. Fox specifically. You helped me learn about the heat sensing pits, which you could see perfectly there in that shot there. Looking at the base of the tail to make sure it comes to either a fine point, then I know it's, not something too dangerous. And if it's blunt or has a rattle, I'm looking at something dangerous here. But there was also another really cool technique that you always teach us. It's something about taking 2 steps back. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
So when you're outside, whether it's in your yard or on a trail, if you see a rattlesnake, I like to tell people take 2 steps back, Jack. It's easy for kids to remember. 2 steps back, Jack. And once you take those 2 steps back, you should be out of the striking range of the rattlesnake. So in most parts of the US, you're not going to see a rattlesnake bigger than about 5 feet. There are a few species that can rarely get up to about 8 feet, but that's exceptionally rare. And these snakes can only strike a third to half their body length. So if you have a 5-foot snake and you take 2 steps back, you should be well over 3 feet away and safe. So it's perfectly fine to just admire that snake. Keep a distance, don't agitate it, don't get close enough to get bitten, and you can have a wonderful, delightful experience. These are very curious animals. You can see that snake is checking us out. It's not even rattling, it's just like wondering what's going on. You can see the tongue flick, trying to sample the air and figure out what is going on. These snakes deserve to be left alone. They are a natural part of the environment. They belong there. And even if they're in our yard, we should be able to put them into a trash can or bucket and take them half a mile down the road, a mile down the road, and let them go.
No, absolutely. And by taking 2 steps back, you're avoiding a bite. avoiding serious injury, up to $500,000 bill, just because of that anti-venom, because it's so expensive, and the possibility of losing a finger or even an entire limb. Other than that, I've always heard the saying that, there's a difference between adults and babies, that one is more dangerous than the other one. And I believe it's that the baby is more dangerous because it can't control its venom. Now, this was something you specifically studied when you were doing your master's, correct?
That was my PhD work.
Oh, your PhD.
And at that time, I was unaware of the myth, and I will call it a myth. So the babies, yes, as you mentioned, they have been purportedly more dangerous because they can't control the amount of venom they inject and therefore release all of it. The simple realities are they don't have much venom compared to an adult. The adults, they can control the amount of venom they inject. My research showed that. It's not like they're helpless. And they use much less. The adults absolutely use more venom when they're biting to feed and when they're biting to defend themselves. And furthermore, if you look at the medical records of people, which we have analyzed, it's very clear that the larger the snake, the much more severe the envenomation. And I went ahead and looked at old library records, newspaper archives, to find out where this story might have originated. And I learned that in around 1970 was when it first appeared. And between 1970 and 1990, almost all the stories that came out of newspaper stories that came out of California had it wrong. Stories elsewhere in the US had it right. And then after about 1990, it's been wrong everywhere. And so with the internet age, this misinformation has spread. And I interviewed college students across the US by asking teachers in college to survey their students, and found that familiarity with this myth was highest in the southwestern US, and it declined as you went north and east. So I think that crazy state called California, hotbed of liberalism, I think that's where the myth originated around 1970, okay?
Hey, well, thanks so much, Dr. Hayes, and that makes complete sense. I can totally see why people would get, a little worried, because you would think that babies don't have the capabilities of controlling this venom that they have. But
they do.
Yeah, luckily they do. They're as smart as just the adults, although they may not be as easily distinguishable like the adults would be, because they're so tiny, and sometimes you miss that blunt tail. But I have another question for you, Dr. Hayes. Hey, what is your favorite rattlesnake if you had to say you could only pick one?
I would be the Sidewinder. Are you going to pull one out?
Yeah, I sure am. Can you tell us a little bit about the Sidewinder?
I saw some sidewinding right there. Look at the horns on its head. That is a beautiful creature. They don't get as big as other rattlesnakes, but they're so unique with their locomotion, their form of locomotion, and their horns. Those horns above the eyes are thought to protect the eyes. They're in sandy burrows, and the sand wants to crumble down. And the sidewinding locomotion is helpful on loose, sandy soils. It minimizes slippage, and it reduces contact, because often when they're moving faster, they have basically two loops that are in contact with the ground at a time. And much of the body is actually in the air. You can actually see that right now. So it reduces contact with the hot soil. And what's interesting is there are some vipers in other parts of the world, in Asia and Africa, that look just like the snake. They act just like the snake by sidewinding. They have the horns on above their eyes, but they don't have the rattle. And they didn't acquire these traits from the same ancestor. They evolved those traits independently. Now, I'm not talking about evolution in the big sense. We're talking microevolutionary change. But these are species of snakes that evolve the same attributes because they live in similar environments. Very fascinating.
Wow, that's incredible. So a snake species has a specific and unique way of moving, just like the Sidewinder, just so that it has a specific adaptation that will help it to survive in that specific environment.
A desert habitat, yes.
That's amazing. And you're saying that not only does this one do that, but other species do, like the
Yes.
reason why there are sometimes different colors, or the reason why they have sometimes different venoms at different stages in life?
Yes.
Now, much as I love the Sidewinder, we're going to have to start wrapping this up a little bit. There was one last thing that I wanted to touch on, being that we are part of a medical university. And rattlesnakes kind of have the full circle there. So we not only treat rattlesnake victims at the hospital, but there's ways that we are able to use rattlesnakes, and they're so much more important to us than their obvious the inherent value that all species have, and as well as pest reduction. But rattlesnakes are actually really important for research purposes, right? So how can we use them for that?
So the venom has been used as a number of molecular tools to explore various diseases and other biochemical properties of various chemicals. What's really fascinating is that the venom from rattlesnakes, as well as other venomous animals, has been tapped by humans to create drugs that treat health conditions. And quite a few drug administration, is that what it is?
Drug administration.
And so we have things like Bayeta, which is derived from the venom of the Gila monster, a lizard. It's used to treat diabetes. And what's really fun right now is at Loma Linda University, there are researchers. The ideas are not mine, but some of the work is being done in my lab. We're talking about John Zhang, who's doing brain injury studies, and a student of his, or a student of mine, Zach Travis. So they are showing that if you are going to, well, we have a big problem with bleeding during and after a surgery. And if you are to inject a small quantity of venom into a rat for 3 days in a row, that venom causes some bleeding and swelling. And if that, oh, that looks nice. And then on the 4th day, when they do surgery of the rats, there is measurably less bleeding and swelling because that rat has harnessed its own protective mechanisms to stop the bleeding and swelling. So in the future, we may actually have a treatment whereby we inject venom or something synthetic into patients several days in advance of a surgery, and then do surgery to improve the outcome.
Daniel, is there something you want to say about this fella?
I'll say something. That's a beautiful Pacific rattlesnake. And that's from Southern California, and its venom is somewhat unique. It's got a lot of myotoxins that cause injury to your muscle. It makes your muscle often ripple under your skin after you've been bitten. And the antivenom has a tough time treating that particular toxin. So we have to be careful with these snakes.
And then one last point I always like to point out, and something that I've learned definitely from taking Dr. Hayes' courses and going out with him and finding these beautiful animals all the time. Hey, Dr. Hayes, how many times have you had a rattlesnake chase you to just try to kill you?
Oh, it happens at least twice a week, Daniel. I'm kidding. No, these snakes don't chase us. They're afraid of us. They're more afraid of us than we are of them, I can assure you. When they see us, their heart rate starts going up. They want nothing to do with us. They want to go the opposite direction. They're frightened. Their first response is often to sit motionless and hope that they're not going to be seen or injured. And only as a measure of last defense do they begin to rattle and stick the head up and strike at you. They don't want to bite you, but they will to defend themselves. And again, the best approach for treating them is to leave them alone, just admire them for where they are. These are creatures that God created, and we should just leave them in their place.
Absolutely. And I couldn't have said it any better than you, Dr. Hayes. these animals definitely don't want anything to do with us. They get scared of us, and the last thing they want to do is have us either accidentally step on them or pick them up and move them around from where they were. I've come across countless of them, and I'm sure you have, where I walked right by it and it didn't move even a little muscle or even rattled because it thought it was completely camouflaged. And it was, because I completely missed it until I looked back and, oh, there it was. So, but a beautiful animal that God definitely created and left on this earth just like he left us, and something I think that could be absolutely beautiful and admired from a good distance, 2 steps back, of course.
Well stated.
Well, Dr. Hayes, thank you so much for taking the time to chat with us today and answer our questions. We are very grateful for your invaluable resource and all the teaching that you provide to us on a regular basis. Daniel, any closing remarks?
Hey, just like Dr. Hayes said, 2 steps back, Jack. Be careful where you're putting your hands and feet at all times. And remember that they're just beautiful creatures that God created that live here and around us, and we just need to be wary and careful around them at times.
All right. Well, thank you so much. Thank you, everyone, for joining us.
Thanks again, Dr. Hayes.
My pleasure.